Here. Welcome, Lance. Colleagues, as we're preparing to start, if you would like to pop into the text chat and just introduce yourself, let us know where you are joining us from and what role you are going to be joining us today in. So are you here as a member of teaching team? Are you here in a capacity as academic support staff of some kind? Just let us know where you are joining us from. That will help us to make sure that we can adjust what we're doing today in order to suit your needs. Hi, Mary, welcome back. Good to have you here. Okay, colleagues, so we're just taking a couple of minutes to greet in the text chat and to check in and just say where we are joining from and what kind of capacity we are joining in. So today's session responds in some ways to the crisis around reading, both in the higher education context and more widely across South Africa. But we are focusing very much today on what it is that we can do within our context and within the current context and the current moment to support reading through careful learning design and through carefully chosen tools and activities and text. So we're focusing a little bit on that end of things today, but I'm fairly sure that our conversation will drift into some of the bigger issues. So as I said, welcome to Mary, welcome to Leslie, good to have you on board. Welcome also to Bastian, good to have you here today. Okay, hi Chengwen. So just to encourage folks to jump into the text chat and let us know where you are joining us from. So if you're based in a department or faculty, let us know that. And then the kind of role that you are in generally in terms of your courses. So are you in an academic teaching role? So do you have kind of course convener type control over a course, or are you in more of an academic support role, joining us from the libraries or a space like that? So let us know where you are joining us from and the kind of role that you're in. Welcome, Sabelo. Good to have you here. Hi, Monique. Welcome back. I'm going to start sharing my screen, colleagues, just so that we've got a bit of a focal point for today. But good to have everyone in the room. A couple of invitations for today's session. These are by no means rules of any kind. Some invitations for today's session. I would like to invite you to please feel free to make full use of the text chat at any point in time. So if you have a question or a query, I would invite you to use, or comment, something that you want to share, something that you want to add, that you think nuances in some particular way what I'm saying. I want to invite you to please feel free to use the text chat in relation to that as much as you would like. I would also strongly like to invite you to please feel free to use your to use the mic as well. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see there's a little microphone. It's the very first icon on the extreme left. Most people's will be muted, but if you click on it, you can unmute it. You can also unmute yourself by simply clicking on your own face, and that will allow you pop up some options, one of which is to unmute yourself. So I would strongly like to welcome you again. Please feel free at any point in today's session, if you have something that you want to add to the conversation with your voice, please feel free to unmute. I keep my participants window open usually, so I can often see if people unmute, and I will invite you to speak immediately. So if you would like to add something to the flow of the presentation in the moment with your voice, you may do that, as well as, of course, using the text chat. And finally, for anyone who is at all uncomfortable with simply unmuting, at the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions bar, reactions icon. And when you click on that, there's a little raise hand option. And if you raise your hand, Mary, I see, has found the sprinkle, a little celebration option. If you click on the raise hand bar, then that is a good place as well if you are a little bit more shy and don't want to necessarily just call out. Okay, so welcome to today's session. It is lovely to have you all on board. We are here today to chat a little bit about reading in higher education and reading in higher education in the South African context. So I'm going to just start by just contextualizing very briefly. Apologies, my screen is a little bit stuck. That's not good. Okay, colleagues, I'm going to ask a quick favor. Can you all hear me? Oh, there we go. It's starting to do what it should do. Fantastic. Thank you. If at any point my sound disappears, please will somebody let me know via text. So the kind of brief or the promise for today's session was to think together about how we can help our learners, how we can help our learners to experience the kind of power of, to steal the Google Scholar phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants, how we can help our learners to do that using some carefully chosen tools and text. Before we dive into that though, just to set up the following things. In the South African context, from primary school onwards, our students face substantial reading challenges. Students in grade 4 in South Africa read at a substantially lower level than their international counterparts. This is, of course, because in a multilingual society like ours, most of our students swap from reading in a home language in grades 1, 2, and 3 to reading in a second or even third, and in some cases, quite frankly, what feels like almost a foreign language in grade 4. And so this has substantial impacts on their capacity to continue their reading trajectories. Additionally, in the South African context, reading is quite expensive. Access to books, both for the very focused mother tongue market and more broadly, are often priced out of the bracket of many South Africans. And so in many cases, our students live in textually limited or textually constrained spaces where they don't have a great deal of access to library books that, for example, they can choose for themselves and so on. And these are things that cause major disruptions to students' ability to develop as independent and fluent readers in their own regard. So one of the things that we have to think about in the higher education context is, given that many of our students come into higher education as people who are not confident readers in the language of teaching and learning, i.e. in the UCT context, come to us as less than confident readers of English, and particularly come to us as novice readers of the kinds of texts that we use and rely on in the higher education context, then very quickly we have to see ourselves as the kinds of people who support that reading activity. So before we go any further today, what I would like to do is I would like to offer you an opportunity to join me in a conversation and to think a little bit about, how do students read in your course? What do students do in your course to read? And the way that I'm going to ask you to share this with me is, I'm going to ask everybody to take the opportunity to share in a Jamboard space. So dropped into the text chat is a link to a Jamboard, which you should be able to get to fairly easily. Please let me know if you have any problems accessing that. The way that Jamboard works, colleagues, and I hope that you can all see my Jamboard on your screen at the moment. The way the Jamboard works is over on the left-hand side column here. There are some additional icons. These icons, the easiest of these icons to use is the sticky note tool, which is the fourth item on the list. Just looks like a little rectangle with a couple of lines, horizontal lines on it. And if you click on that, a little pop-up will appear and you can simply add text of your choice. You can change the color of the pop-up. There's a green option, a blue, a pink, and orange, entirely up to you if you want to change the color. But the question I want to ask you is, for your course, how do students read for your course and how do they read in your course? And indeed, Jamboard is excellent for brainstorming as a group. So thank you very much for adding that idea. So I'm going to ask you to jump onto the Jamboard and to think about answering that question for me. How do students read in your course? One of the things that Jamboard does, which is less than friendly, is it stacks everything in a pile at the top. So every now and then you might find that I will move things to just give us all a little bit more space. Okay, so we've got a couple of ideas appearing already. In your course, how do students read? And I've got a comment, readings are pretty dense if they're not given prompts on how to read or what set of prompts to do the reading against. Students just don't engage. Yeah. I can remember when I first started at UCT in my master's course, there would just be like 5 readings a week and I would have no idea where to begin. I came to it after a good 10-year break, teaching in other spaces. Aha. So how do students read for in my course? They read largely journal articles. They should read Braille literature. They need to search, and that's tricky. Okay. So what I'm hearing is a little bit of, what do my students read? And that's a useful starting point. But I also want to ask you, how do they read? Do you know what they are doing with those readings? Interesting comment here. In my teaching, I scaffold reading an academic article in the humanities by doing a curated reading with them in real time. Once they have the skills, they can then read independently. Yeah, I think that's an incredibly productive idea, the idea of we read a thing together. Students lack judgment. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. I make some of these a bit smaller just so I can squeeze some more ideas in. So I would love to hear a little bit more about how do we imagine our students read? Do they grab a journal art or do they get a PDF and sit down and read it beginning to end? Okay, they read from start to finish, often not sure what to focus on. Yeah. They read close, they read when the assignment is very close. Yes, this is absolutely, absolutely true. And we know this based on things like when students download text from spaces like LMSs. We also know this because often that's when we set up ways of our students to engage with us about texts, they won't engage with it in the week that it's set. They will engage with it when the assignment is due, and that's when you get a little flurry of questions. Since they have to write a response to the readings, I get a sense that they read for content. A few are more critical in their responses. Many don't manage to respond to the article, but do contribute in the class discussions. Okay. That's interesting because that suggests that there's quite a layered response already in that course around you can respond in a class discussion, you can respond in writing. Aha. They read without searching for what is relevant. So I think it's worth remembering that our students come out of a school culture where hands-on contact with text is incredibly, incredibly limited, where everything that is important that they're going to need to know, that they're going to need to engage with, will also come out of an educator's mouth at some point or another. So it's very the shift in the reading culture from a South African school's classroom to the reading culture of a South African higher education classroom is huge. It's an entirely, one of the phrases that a student used a couple of years ago in a forum discussion in a little focus group was, they said to me, Shonali, it was like I fell asleep one day and I woke up in a new world another day. And I just didn't know what was happening for like a term. I had no idea where to go, what to look at, where to be. And this particularly pertains to their reading. Because in a lot of South African classrooms, a lot of the reading that happens is shared reading aloud. And that's quite a different experience from reading on your own. Okay, so having looked at those ideas on that board and some of the things that I've been saying in the background, does anyone want to take the mic and say out loud anything about how they have been managing reading in their context, or how this feels, what this makes them think about? So given what's on the board, take a moment, have a look at it properly, let it sink in. Given what I've been saying about, number one, a classroom culture shift around reading, two, multilingualism and the disruptions and discontinuities in students' reading trajectories, and thirdly, the general paucity of access to literature, and to print literature in many students' homes. Are there any particular comments that anyone wants to make? Anything you want to challenge, anything you want to nuance, anything you want to add to that image or that picture?
So I think that one of the things that happens, one of the other changes that happens between school and university, and possibly even more between undergrad and postgrad, is that a lot of your your readings are not as focused. So when you're at school, if you get given something to read, everything that's there is what you're meant to know.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when you get to a research situation, most of what you read is actually not relevant. It's background, and in each item that you read, you're looking for what is relevant. So if you just sort of read and take in everything, you end up with far too much irrelevant information.
Absolutely.
And I think students find it quite hard to do that triage of what they should be paying attention to for the particular situation.
Absolutely, Leslie. That is entirely accurate. And so one of the things that we might do is help our students to understand, what am I reading this for? Am I reading it for content? Am I reading it for method? Am I reading it for the way the argument is made? Because sometimes that's another thing we share with our students.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Bastian, I see a hand.
Hi, Shonali, and
Hi.
hi, and thank you for the session, and thank you to Leslie for your comment. I think that's absolutely accurate. So without wanting to put in some advertising, I teach postgraduates how to read an academic article. I teach it online now because of COVID. I teach it at the UCT Office for Postgraduate Support, but anybody is welcome to come along to that session. It's 3 hours, and there's going to be one in October, where if you want to come along and see how it's scaffolded, that might be useful. But what I want to say is that I'm finding that at a postgraduate level, and I can only speak for the humanities, what one has to do is exactly what Leslie is pointing out, is say, bring an article that relates to your thesis, and we're going to read it together. And then what inevitably happens is that there'll be a student there who'll say, well, I can't find one. Yes, Sylvia, I'll post that info just now. So people then need to find one. And then what I do is I respond to that online, and I say, right, which one of you would like an article? And because that one person's been brave enough to say, well, I'm in this field, where do I find an article? You search online with them. Often I've got up to 25 people online in that workshop. Yeah. Exciting, because they can hear from other people how to do things. The second thing I want to say is that the big shift that students have to make, and which I teach, is that at university, you're not looking necessarily at descriptive context, at content. You're actually looking at arguments, and that's a very hard jump for anybody to make. I have to see how different academics argue. The way I scaffold things for these courses is that I physically get them to look at the back of the article while I'm on screen, so to speak. And then people are allowed to type up whether they find the argument or not. It's kind of like a little game. So it's very practical. And I found that using that kind of approach is what's actually very necessary. So I'll stop it there and put some info in the chat. Thank you.
That would be very, very useful. And so I think what you're talking about there is taking the kind of implicit behaviors, the hidden behaviors of reading, and making them very clear to students. Saying to students, show me on the page where the argument is. And if you show me on your article and another article, we quickly start to see that the argument will always come up somewhere in the first page and a half, and somewhere in the abstract, and somewhere at the end, hopefully. And so I think that process of making the hidden behaviors of reading explicit, and making the hidden relationships of reading explicit, as an experienced academic reader, you are going to, every now and then you'll pick up an article and you'll just you'll skim the first page in a bit, and you'll just toss it aside with a disgusted grunt and go, this is rubbish and I'm not going to waste any of my time on it. You just put it one side. Our students won't feel like they can do that. or you'll read it because you want one number out of that article. You want one figure, one claim about a particular context, and everything else is irrelevant. So that kind of relationship to reading, as well as the skill of reading, is absolutely critical. Okay, I want to invite people today to keep bringing back the things that I'm going to suggest in the rest of today's session. I want you to keep bringing it back to this conversation that we started having, which is how do students read for and in our courses? And looking at what people have said on the screen, one of the things that I just want to kind of emphasize is perhaps while we can see when things are going wrong for our students, what we're not good at seeing is what they're doing on a day-to-day basis when it comes to their reading. And so today's session, one of the things that I want to suggest is a series of practices or activities paired with particular tools that you might be able to use in the digital or virtual space that will enable you to get a better sense of, on a day-to-day basis, what are your students doing to read? How are they reading, and so on. Please remember, feel free to grab the mic at any point, unmute and ask a question. Similarly, please feel free to chat in the text chat. I have that open as well, and I will chat. I'll pull on that every now and then as well. So, quick question. Does anyone in this group use podcasts? Do you use podcasts in your teaching? I think of a podcast as primarily an audio recording. So do you use regular audio recordings in your teaching? If you do, jump into the text chat and just give me a yes. Not yet, but I would love to. I'm seeing more and more. So as we spend more time online, and as we spend more time online in formal learning spaces, I'm seeing more and more people talk about the extent to which video is a little bit tiring sometimes. And that the idea of being able to listen to somebody talk about something, even if it's just for 15 minutes while you take a walk around the block, or while you do the washing, or hang out the clothes, or I don't know, do 1,000 steps or whatever it is that you need to do. The thought of listening to somebody while you physically do something else can be quite appealing. Nicola, you're saying that you use podcasts at the moment. Do you want to tell us, before we dive in, a little bit about how you use podcasts? Oh, Nicola has no audio. I'm so sorry, Nicola. Okay, if you'd like to type us a little message, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, I might catch up with Nicola via a phone call later, and we can work with that. Okay, I find topic related podcasts out in the world. So absolutely, one of the things that you can do in terms of podcasts is you can, of course, draw on the absolutely wonderful podcasts that exist in the kind of wilds, in the internet wilds. So there's a huge range of podcasts out there, and you can indeed listen to those and encourage your students to listen to those in advance of teaching a particular section. But for today, what I'd like to do is focus our attention on the possibility of using podcasts to support reading. Okay, so that's where we are, where we're going to focus our attention for now. So one of the things that you can use a podcast to do is you can use a podcast to frame a reading for students. So give them a bit of context, to direct their reading attention when they go to actually engage with that particular reading, and perhaps to give them a sense of the structure and shape of the reading. Very often when our students read, it's not the content of the reading necessarily that they find wildly overwhelming, but it's just the structure of it, the structure of the argument, particularly for humanities students, can be very disconcerting, can be very overwhelming. In places like the sciences, in engineering, sometimes the argument is a lot clearer because the patterns are a little bit more constrained. So the suggestion around using podcasts was developed out of some work that was done at Rhodes University. And a particular lecturer there tried the following pattern. She said to her students, a particular day is reading day. So Monday in my course is reading day. You take these 2 readings, you work through them on Monday. Then on Tuesday, I release a podcast that pulls together some of the key parts of that reading. And then on Wednesday, we have a short multiple choice set of questions about a little quiz. My suggestion is that you consider reversing that podcast reading day order. In the South African context, particularly, I think that our students really need a lot of support to be able to jump into a reading. And so being able to say to them, this reading is really exciting, really relevant, really important, because give them a reason to read the reading. Then when you are reading this particular thing, look out for, what do I want you to take away from it? Look out for an answer to these 3 questions. And then something about the structure of the reading. As you're reading, this is the shape that you're going to engage with. The person sets up a problem. They share with you a way that they approached researching that problem, approached engaging with that problem, and then you'll find the kind of findings section after that. This sounds incredibly superficial and simple to us and to people who have had a great deal of opportunity to engage with academic text. But for students who normally read bullet points in a textbook, this is a big step. One of the other reasons that I'm strongly recommending the notion of recordings, audio recordings particularly, is there's an opportunity to personalize and to humanize your students' first engagement with the text through your voice. So they know Sabelo, they know Jennifer, they know Lancelot, they know you as a human being. And when they hear you talking about a particular reading and saying, you know what, I was really interested in this. This really provoked my thinking in the following ways. That's an affective reason for them to engage with that text. And of course, it gives you an opportunity through the podcast to help your students to connect to the reading that you're giving them, the text you're giving them, with something that happened in a lecture, something that happened in a classroom activity, something that will be happening in an assessment. Okay, so limitations around the podcast, keep them small if you can. Something in the region of about 10 to 12 minutes, up to 15 minutes is probably a good introductory podcast for introducing a reading. If, on the other hand, you're going to be pulling together ideas from multiple readings, you might want to take a little bit longer because you might want to spend a few minutes with each of those readings, pulling them together into a picture for your students. So a podcast is a really, really good way at the beginning of a reading process to help students find a doorway into a reading. Are there any comments or questions or ideas about that? I would suggest, don't feel that you need to do this for every single reading. That's going to be exhausting for you. I would pick key readings. So if you had a key reading every single week that you thought, I really need each of my students to get into this, consider doing some kind of introductory podcast for that reading and that reading only. If you want to do it for all of them and you have the time and the capacity, that would be amazing. But I think that there's something about signaling to your students that this is a critical reading. This is something that they really need to engage with, and flagging that through a podcast that can be quite powerful. Okay, I'm going to move along, but please feel free to either pop comments into the text chat or unmute yourself and comment at any point. I thought that one of the other tools that I might introduce you to that is useful for students, for helping to get students into a reading, is a little tool called Mote. And Mote is a tool that you can add to your Chrome extension. It adds itself to your Google Drive. And what it does is it allows you to add short voice notes against specific parts of text. So in the same way that a podcast is an opportunity to guide your students into a particular text from a kind of welcome, here's an open door, welcome to the text kind of scenario, what Mote does is it gives you an opportunity to drop voice notes in against very specific parts of the text. So sometimes in a text, an article will refer to another article. And if the students haven't read article number 2, they will be hopelessly confused by what it is that the text that you are suggesting they read is saying. And then what you could do is you can drop a little note in there saying, here's a quick summary of article 2. I don't expect you to go and read it unless you're really fascinated by it, but here's a summary and you can move on. You can also add little voice notes that, for example, point out changes in structure. So when things are happening in the shape of an article, this is a section where they're reviewing a particular concept in the literature, but look at how it changes here. They're no longer reviewing the concept in the literature, they're reviewing some other element of the literature, or they've moved to thinking about different waves of work around a particular issue. Those are things that you can signal for your students with little voice notes. You can also combine, of course, the voice notes with ordinary text notes, but the voice notes are really useful for when you want to explain something or when you want to prompt your students to think about something. So when you want to ask them a question and say, pause here, stop reading, go away and make a list of these things, or go away and think about how this particular concept plays its way out in the South African context or in a disciplinary context, entirely up to you, of course. And in order to make that work, you need a combination of certain tools. So you need the Mote tool, which you can add as a Chrome extension. You would need your readings uploaded to somewhere like a Google Drive space. And you might want to, as a follow-up, encourage your students to respond, in which case you would need some kind of tool for student comments. And that could be a forum discussion, that could be a blog, it could be a WhatsApp chat group, if that's what you're using for your course. There are a range of different ways to get students to come into that conversation. You could also ask students to annotate readings themselves in this way. So you could have a group of students work out an annotated reading for next week's reading, and it could be their voices that could be heard. Okay, pausing there for a second. Any questions, any comments, any thoughts about what I'm suggesting so far? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone unmute. Oh, Claudia, go for it.
Sounds great.
I think, okay, I think works really, really well with smaller groups if you want them to respond. But if you just want to get your voice into your students' heads a bit, that sense of, if you were reading in a classroom, Bastian was saying this idea of co-reading with people, having them read something and you're reading alongside them. This might be a way to sort of start to mimic that in a virtual space. Okay, moving on to some additional reading ideas. So now we've got our students into the reading. We've given them perhaps some kind of little inspiring podcast with a why is this important? Why should you be involved? We've given them through perhaps some little voice notes, some handholds, some scaffolds in the reading itself to help them to identify what's important. I want to just say, apologies, I should have said this in relation to this slide. You might do this more at the beginning of a course. You might do this more in relation to key readings. It would be a lot of work and possibly quite exhausting for you and your students if you had this for absolutely all the readings you offered in a course. But if you offered this to students at the beginning of a course while they were reading, while they were learning to read for your course, for your discipline, and then start to taper it off towards the end, that would be an acceptable learning design pattern to use. Okay, so we've got them into the reading, but now they're in the readings and the readings are still tough and they're still challenging and a bit difficult to work with. So one of the things we might consider is we might consider in a kind of multilingual space like South Africa, we might consider doing something towards co-constructing multilingual glossaries for our students. So the glossary could start off with simply an attempt to support students' reading of academic texts through identifying a list of key terms. If you liked, you and your tutor team could collaborate and create a list of these key terms and create the possible meanings for them. You could also task your students with doing that. So you could get students individually or in pairs or small groups to generate definitions and examples for key terms. If you're going to do that, what you're going to require is you're going to require some kind of group chat tool for your students. So let's say that your design is, I'm going to put my students into groups of 3 or 4. I'm going to give each group one definition or one key term. They're going to come up with one definition and 2 examples. So the first thing you have to do is set up a space for your students to chat. Again, it could be a forum, it could be a chat room. If you were doing it live, you could say to them, we're going to be in the chat room working on this term at 10 o'clock on Tuesday, you have to be there. Okay, so you need a chat space. Then you need some kind of group work collaborative space. This could be something like just a Google Doc. It could be something like slides. My students seem to respond better in some ways to slides than Google Docs. It could be within Vula, it could be something like student pages. Any of those would work as a space where your students in their small groups could come together to generate a definition and to offer some examples in relation to that definition. Then you need to figure out how you want to publish this. And you can simply publish the link, in which case you don't need to change out of the Google Doc format, or you might want to copy and paste it to a lessons page or something like that on Vula. That would be up to you entirely. I would be tempted to keep it as a live doc so that it could grow over the duration of the course. And then you might want to create some kind of comments feature. So you might want to create the possibility for your broader classroom group to comment on the definitions and examples that are offered. So you could use the comments tool within Vula, or you could simply enable the comments tool on a Google Doc, and your students could add to that in that way. It's very useful in this instance to ask your students to provide a reference for their definitions, a reference for their examples, if that's possible, and to require links. So for example, if a student says, if a student gives you a particular image as an example of a key term, it would be useful if they were to provide the reference for where they got that image, article, etc. It's the kind of thing that will support students using that information. Okay, pausing there. Any questions about this idea of co-constructed glossaries, whether they are monolingual or multilingual glossaries? Any questions or comments on that?
Just a
Leslie.
comment is that I read an article recently. There's a, sorry, excuse the dog.
Not a problem.
There's an Africa-wide university group which is busy trying to translate scientific papers and therefore to construct scientific jargon for I think 6 African languages. And among them was isiZulu and I think Setswana from South Africa.
Right.
And it might be worth, if anybody else is a scientific person here, sort of finding out how they're going about it, because that it would be nice to have to link into something wider.
Absolutely. Leslie, if you don't mind popping, if you have the link to that somewhere handy.
I'm afraid I don't.
Okay, well then we'll all just keep eyes open for it.
Yeah, I think I read about it on the conversation.
Okay, that's a good place. I'll go have a little hunt.
That would be a place to look for it. Yeah.
I'll go have a little hunt, and if I can find it, I'll put the link in here.
Thanks. Sorry.
No problem. Not a problem at all. It's useful to know that something exists, even if we're not quite sure where. Because I think that's the kind of thing where, so building language, building discourse in multiple language for a particular discipline is a massive intellectual challenge. And helping our students to make connections to home languages, to concepts in their home languages, is not something that monolingual educators are particularly skilled at. And so creating spaces for our students to support each other in their reading, to be able to make connections to either existing concepts in home language, to be able to stretch concepts, is useful. Difficult, but useful. Okay, so moving on then from the idea of co-constructed glossaries. One of the things that we can think about in terms of supporting student reading is supporting the very key activity of paraphrasing through some kind of activity with it. Our students often struggle with the idea of paraphrasing. The response we often get from students is, but so-and-so said it perfectly. How am I ever going to fix it? How am I ever going to make it better or even just as good? And so there's a strong preference often amongst our students for extensive quotation. And even if they are quoting perfectly correctly, quotation marks in place, references in place, the flow of ideas is perfectly acceptable, being unable to paraphrase a text limits what it is that they're able to do with it. And so one of the suggestions that the literature offers is this idea of supporting paraphrasing through short answer quizzes, or supporting paraphrasing through multiple choice quizzes. And in this particular activity, what you'll see that they've done is that they have original piece of text, and then they have 3 paraphrases over here. What I quite like, and I think they could have strengthened it a bit further, is I like the fact that they frame it as student paraphrases. So these are, they claim, 3 very grown-up looking students, but nonetheless 3 students offering a rephrasing of this text and asking the reader, the participant, to choose which one of these they like the best. And so seeing partial paraphrases is very, very useful to the student. Okay, so being able to say, well, what did this person do? They went in the field of psychology, so they added some words. That's interesting. This person kept the in psychology. Did somebody change the structure of the sentence? Possibly this person looks like they've done quite a lot of condensing. Haven't read these in detail, so I'm not absolutely clear which one of them I like the best. But getting students to think about which of these they like and why they like them. And I think that critical why is useful. So using in the UCT ecology, something like the tests and quizzes tool with with multiple choice questions, where you give students key bits of text that are paraphrased in various ways, not necessarily simplistically, here's a bad paraphrase, here's a good paraphrase, but that are paraphrased in varying ways, can force students to read and reread text and engage with what they do and don't like about it. So using multiple choice questions. The other tool in the tests and quizzes repertoire, the tests and quizzes tool at UCT at Vula that's incredibly important, is that there is a tool called hotspots. And the hotspots tool allows you to highlight pieces of text, allows you to identify pieces of text on an image. So if you were to upload, for example, an abstract and say to students, find the framing portions of this abstract as a question, find the argument or the research question in this abstract. Those are things that you could do, and that would take students less time than to write out a response, but would give them an opportunity to engage with finding those elements in the reading themselves. So one of the things that we can do, I'm suggesting here, is that we can substantially, during the in-depth reading phase, support our students to increase their ability to paraphrase and to pull together ideas through quite simple tools like multiple choice questions and tests and quizzes, and the hotspots question and tests and quizzes. Pausing for a second. Any questions, any comments? I'm not seeing any text. I'm not seeing anyone unmuting. So I'm going to continue. I've just got a couple more of these that I thought that we could chat through. And then we'll take some questions, some comments, some ideas at the end. So a key tool, a key kind of pedagogy in the higher education space is this idea of reading groups. Normally, we gather in a seminar room or discussion room of some kind, and we talk about what we've read already, okay? And in a way, the solution, the option I'm suggesting here, tries to replicate that seminar room experience, but virtually. So typically in these online reading groups, what we do is we talk about reading. We don't often read together. We often read somewhere else, but we come together in small groups to talk about what we've understood, what we've made of what we understood, and so on. There are a couple of challenges with these. One is that you require facilitation during the session. If you abandon your students to talk about a particular reading without some kind of clear structure to their conversation, and preferably without someone to hold them in that structure, they may well struggle to remain focused on chatting about the reading. People may drift away, they may get distracted, they may not participate, they may land up talking about something else entirely. So ideally, if you're looking for online reading groups, you need to think about facilitation. That can either involve the facilitation of an expert other, so a lecturer, a tutor, a TA, someone like that, or it can require that students themselves circulate the role of who's convening the group, who is guiding the group, and so on. And you might work with those people a little bit to make sure that they understand their roles and are capable of carrying them out. If you're going to use online reading groups, just be aware that there's some extent to which you're going to need to do some tech troubleshooting. So often students will come to a session and they will be in a position where they don't have where they can't speak. So either their mic's not working or they're in a crowded, loud place and they can't necessarily speak easily. And so it requires a bit of preparation and a little bit of technical support in advance in order for people to make use of that. And then remember, if you're wanting to do those online reading groups, it's a good idea to make sure that you consider the possibility of breakout rooms, so that instead of you having 20 people in a TUT doing an online reading group together, that you might have 8 to 10 people or even 5 people in a room. And in order to make this happen, you're going to need to have some kind of space, some kind of collaborative annotation software that your students can engage with together, and then some kind of video conferencing tool. The collaborative annotation software is kind of an optional extra for this activity. You could just have students with PDFs on their screens, commenting on those and working from that. But the video conferencing tool is absolutely critical for this. Some caveats about this particular structure. Number one, it's data intensive, particularly if you're going to actually use the video. You might Ask your students to turn their video off and just have voices, and maybe a shared document where you gather your ideas as notes together. So that definitely reduces the video demand. It, of course, also requires some kind of live class time, which is simultaneously something that our students are saying they desperately want, but that also they find very constraining. So that's something that you will need to negotiate with your students in advance. I'm seeing increasingly that it is something that students are definitely asking for. They want some kind of live contact with people, but it might not be 4 times a week. It might be something that you do once a week or once every 2 weeks with kind of, again, key critical readings. Okay, and then I think, I'm going to check, I think we've got 2 more after this. So some light ways of getting students to engage with readings might be doing something like setting up a Padlet for quotable quotes and saying to your students, okay, there are 3 groups for this week. Each group has a reading. I'd like you to go away and pick the most quotable thing you want from that reading, find a quotable quote, and add it to a Padlet. Put the title of the reading on there, put the page on there, put your name on there. And then you can either add a voice note or a video explaining why you added that. And that can be just a very small participatory activity for that week. It could be one of the things that students have to do to demonstrate participation for that week. Again, by using something like a Padlet, which allows the inclusion of voices and videos and visuals, it really does allow your students to be quite creative with how they present those ideas. Okay, and Padlets are very easy to set up within the UCT context. And then almost at the end, our last tool that I want to suggest is a collaborative annotation tool called Hypothesis. Hypothesis is something that you can embed directly into the Vula ecosystem. It allows both you and your students to annotate texts and is probably suitable for groups up to about sort of 20 to 30 people on a single document is acceptable. After that, it becomes a bit wild. But what you can always do after that is you can set up multiple documents with multiple hypothesis overlays for different groups. So if you're in a situation where your course has 4 TUT groups or 10 TUT groups, you can have 10 versions of this document, one for each TUT group to work on. And that's an excellent way for students to question a text. Okay, I'm going to, colleagues, stop there. We've got just a couple of minutes, unfortunately, before the end of the session. But do you have any questions, any comments, any thoughts, any advice that you want to seek about trying out any of these ideas that we have shared here today? I am getting a link to the slides in the meanwhile while I do that. There was a hand. Monique, go for it.
Hi, Sonali. So I just wanted to check with Hypothesis, where you were saying you can set up multiple versions for different type groups. Where would you do that? Would you do that in something like a forum, or how do you?
Easiest place is to do it on a lessons page.
Okay.
And what I would suggest doing is I would link. So assuming you have TUT groups, you're probably already using the section info tool to break up your TUT groups. I would make those different readings with the hypothesis overlay. I would make those visible to specific TUT groups. So TUT group 1 could only see their own one. TUT group 2 could only see theirs, and so on.
Oh, okay.
So that it doesn't become too crazy for your students.
Yeah. Okay.
Otherwise, I mean, particularly with big courses, it can become very overwhelming.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Any other comments or questions, colleagues? Okay, so I have a quick question for everyone here. I have shared with you today a number of different tools. We've looked at podcasts, the idea of Mote for Google Drive, co-constructed glossaries, paraphrasing, online reading groups, Padlet for quotable quotes, and hypothesis. And I would like to ask you if there are any of those in particular that you are interested in playing with in your course. And if you wouldn't mind jumping into the text chat and letting me know whether there are any of those in particular you would be interested in trying out in your course. Thank you, Sylvia. I appreciate your presence. Have a good rest of your day. So just before you leave, folks, just let me know in the text chat if any of those ideas were sort of interesting, something that sparked your attention. And that is something that we might then look into getting a little bit more support and a few more sessions on, so that you might come back and do a whole session on how to create a podcast, for example. Okay, so we had podcasts, we had Mote for Google Drive, we had co-constructed glossaries, tests and quizzes and so on, online reading groups, Padlet for quotable quotes, and hypothesis. Okay, folks, I'm very sure that you all need to run away to other events. Gosh, it's 3 o'clock already. Thank you so much. If on your way out, you just let me know which of those you'd be interested in hearing more about, that would be great. But otherwise, have a lovely afternoon. Take care. Look after yourselves. And please feel free to reach out if you would like some advice about how to bring any of those into your course. We're very happy to do some consultations and some one-on-ones and help you to embed them in your course process. Thanks so much, colleagues. Take care. Have a lovely day. We'll be closing this room shortly. Jennifer, good to see you. Okay, thank you, colleagues. We're going to close the room in a moment. Max, I think we can probably stop there. Thanks, Carol. Bye for now.